Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us straight out of the Judge Vault, and this version of it was suggested by viewer Death1985. Amy plays a Primal Command, and she wants to put Nick's treasure token on top of his library and search her library for a creature card. In response, Nick sacrifices the treasure token. What happens? Alright, so this is a great question, especially if you're preparing for the level 1 judge exam, because I can more or less guarantee that you're gonna see a question on that exam that covers some very similar topics to what we're about to talk about today. So, let's take a look at exactly what's gonna happen when a spell or ability resolves. As a brief aside, to save time, I'm just gonna be saying the word spell here, because that's what the original question was asking about. But activated abilities and triggered abilities that have targets are going to work exactly the same way. So this rule and the stuff that I'm going to be talking about is going to apply exactly the same if you have a case that deals with one of those. So anytime a spell that has targets is going to resolve, then the game has to first check to make sure that those targets are still legal. Now, obviously the targets had to be legal at the time when the spell got cast and the targets got picked, but there's a lot of stuff that can happen that might make it so that the targets have become illegal by the time that the game has to resolve that spell. And so that's the reason why a second check is necessary. So, for example, one way to do this would be to change the characteristics, or if applicable, the controller of the targeted objects, so that they don't match what the spell is trying to target anymore. So, for example, let's say that you were going to try to play a Doomblade against my Grizzly Bears. I could play a spell that made my Grizzly Bears black in response, and if that happened, then my Grizzly Bears would no longer be a non-black creature, so that would mean that it would no longer be a legal target for the Doomblade. I could do something similar if I changed the text of Doomblade so that it said non-green creature instead. So in that case, the Doomblade, when the game checks to see if its targets are legal, is going to be targeting a green creature, and the Doomblade will at that point say target non-green creature. And so, again, that's going to be something that makes the target not legal. Another way that I could protect my Grizzly Bears would be if I did something that gave it hexproof or protection from black in response. Of course, either of those abilities would make it an illegal target for your Doomblade. And there's one other thing that I could do to save my bear from a grisly fate. And that would be if the game checks to see if the target is still legal, but it's not able to find the targeted object in the zone that it's supposed to be, then that means that it will say the target is not legal. So one way to do that would of course be to sacrifice the Grizzly Bears, or return it to my hand. And in those cases, of course, when the game checks, it's not going to be able to find the Grizzly Bears in the zone that it's supposed to be in. Of course, in those cases, I would have to replay the bear or lose it outright, and so that might not be the most optimal way to do things. I could also phase it out, because phasing means that the object is no longer going to be considered to exist for most game purposes. That means that even though the Grizzly Bears would still be on the battlefield, since the game can't find it, that rule would still apply. And finally, if I flicker the Grizzly Bears, that would be another way that I could take advantage of this rule. The reason for this is because anytime an object changes zones, that means that the game is going to consider it to be a brand new object with no connection to its previous identity. And so that means that if I were to flicker the Grizzly Bears, then even though the Grizzly Bears that's on the battlefield after that flicker resolves is the exact same physical piece of cardboard that got targeted by a Doomblade, the game is not going to see it that way. The game is going to think that it became a brand new object with no connection to its previous identity at the time when it got exiled. And so that means when the game is trying to find the Grizzly Bears that got targeted by the Doomblade, it won't be able to do that, and that means that the game is no longer going to consider the Doomblade to have a legal target, because it's not able to find the Grizzly Bears that was originally targeted by that spell. So in all of those diverse examples, even though all kinds of different stuff happened to make it that way, the result is all the same. That being that the Doomblade's target is no longer legal at the time when the Doomblade is about to resolve. So now that we've talked about that check and when it happens and what ways that you could maybe interfere with the results of that check, let's talk about what happens after the check gets performed. And there are two possibilities. One of them is that at least one target is still going to be legal. And in that case, if even one target that the spell had targeted is still a legal target, then that means the spell will resolve as normal. And it'll do as much as it can. If some of the targets have become illegal, as long as some of the targets are still legal, the legal targets will get affected like normal, and the illegal targets will not be affected. The other possibility is if all of the spell's targets are illegal at the time when it tries to resolve, then that means the spell will not resolve at all. It'll just get put into its owner's graveyard and none of its effects will happen, even effects that don't have anything to do with the targets. So this explains exactly why it's probably not a great play to play a Primal Command searching for a creature and putting a treasure token on top of your opponent's library. If they're savvy, they'll know that they can just sacrifice the treasure token, and because the Primal Command, as cast, only has one target, that being the treasure token, which will no longer be on the battlefield, that means all of the targets for Primal Command have become illegal, and the Primal Command will be put into its owner's graveyard with none of its effects happening, even though the searching for a creature is a completely different mode and thematically completely unconnected from putting the permanent on top of its owner's library. Because all of the targets of Primal Command have become illegal, that means that the Primal Command will not resolve. Now, I said that this question was from the Judge Vault, and there have definitely been lots of times where competitive Magic has had this exact same sort of ruling come up, and I guarantee if you were judging at any of those times, this would have been extremely important information to know. For example, when Fairies was the top deck in the metagame, then a lot of decks were playing Cryptic Command, and it was very important to know exactly what Cryptic Command did. I said it was very important to know exactly what Cryptic Command did. That's better. Now, let's say that you took a Cryptic Command. Let's see what modes target. As you can see, based on that version of the card, the only modes that have a target are the ones where you bounce a permanent or the one where you counter a spell. So that could have some really important consequences related to the ruling that we had just talked about. For example, if it was very important for you to make sure that you tapped all of your opponent's creatures, then you might want to make sure you played that Cryptic Command as a tap draw rather than a tap bounce, even if there was an opponent's permanent that you really wanted to bounce. The chances that you could get blown out by your opponent playing a removal spell against that permanent were super high. Or, even worse, they might have a Mistbind click that would remove that permanent, or a Scion of Una that would protect it, and in either of those cases, that play was so swingy that it was almost a guaranteed game over. Another place where this ruling came up a lot would be in the time when Deathright Shaman and Scavenging Ooze were really highly played cards. Back in those times, it was very common for games to get into a situation where each player had one or more of these creatures. To see where this is going, let's notice that both of them have abilities that exile a targeted card from a graveyard and then do some other kind of effect. If both players had the ability to activate this sort of ability, then the games would often devolve into this kind of weird minigame where each player was struggling to have their version of the ability be the one that actually got to exile the card. Because if the card is not in the graveyard at the time when the ability tries to resolve, then guess what? That ability has an illegal target. And because all of its targets are not legal at the time when it's trying to resolve, none of the effects will happen, including the extra bonus effects, which are probably the whole reason why you activated that ability in the first place. There's all kinds of other times when this ruling has come up in the past. If you remember something like this happening when you were playing in a game of Magic, definitely put your favorite examples in the comments below. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.